Alrighty, good evening. This is Jonathan Albin, and this is NycosRPG. And tonight is a very special night. We are not on our schedule because it is the period between 2004 and 2005, the cusp of the year, if you will. And so I take this time to kind of muse a bit about what's going on within the campaigns. Call it being a little loose lipped, call it being a little bit of a troll, I suppose, by providing my players with just tantalizing tidbits of what's going on in the campaign over the next 12 months. But this is the beginning, this is the end of the beginning of the ninth iteration of NyCOS. Now, for those of you that don't know anything about this, I'm Jonathan Albin. I'm a game master who has been telling stories constantly since 1974. I learned to play Dungeons and Dragons from Dave Arneson. He was my buddy's grandpa Dave, and I've been playing constantly since then without with virtually no breaks. I was in the military, and there were some periods of time where I wasn't able to be a storyteller, but for the most part, it's been every week for an average of at least once per week for all 50 years. And in the last 7 to 10 years, it's been between 4 and 9 campaign groups per week that I've been running contemporaneously in the same story with in different locations on the world map, which you can see the frame of behind us. I can show you really quickly what that looks like. Let me go up here, and just for a second we'll flash it. There is the world of NyCOS. Something like 18,275 or something like that hexes in the northern hemisphere alone, and virtually unexplored. I mean, the players certainly get around, and they certainly have visited many of the populated centers, but they have by no means explored the entirety of the world, even in all of that time. As a matter of fact, until just the last 3 months, no players in history ever attempted to cross to the southern continent, and it was only because of the arrival in the last 300 or 400 years in game time of the stars that the players could even risk sailing beyond the sightlines of the continents. So it's a heady time in the world of NyCOS, shall we say. We are currently operating 4 official campaigns and a couple of professional sessions that are in the world of NyCOS but are not of the NyCOS arc. I have not yet verified whether they want to have any part of the Grand Arc or not. So let's just say those two are standalone. I do judiciously use NPCs from time to time from either realm, but it's of no consequence, really. So today we're going to be doing a little bit of housekeeping. I'm going to be going through some model boxes that I've got and sorting between the townsfolk in one box and the rural population, as well as the good guys from the bad guys and the monsters from the beasts, so to speak, so that we'll get kind of a little off kilter. If at any time I'm not talking or whatever, just wave at me, chat at me, and I will do what I can to reconnect with you. I do have both of my cameras operational at this point, but only one of them set up, so I'm going to be using just the primary camera for now. So as you may recall, as with a storytelling life of 50 plus years, I've got a lot of different kinds of things we could talk about. And generally when I'm doing these between the scenes sort of episodes like this, I'll be working on something, but you can feel free to ask questions through the chat or Of course, once this has been recorded, I will perhaps take snippets of that and put it onto YouTube, but I haven't decided yet. There are some merits to keep things in the long form here on Twitch and through Discord. So if you want to become a part of the show and actually perhaps become a communicator with us, I would recommend that you check out our Patreon program as well as NycosRPG for more information on both the property and the lore. For really deep dives in the lore, I would recommend NycosRPG.info or .info, and that is my World Anvil page that has the access to the particulars of snippets of lore going back over the last couple of iterations at least, and has a considerable amount of information on even the older iterations. I do notice I've got an issue with my lighting today. I can't tell whether I'm too bright or too dark. Let me make a quick alteration. Well, that's interesting. That helped a little. At any rate, if we have any problems with the microphone or whatever, let me know as well. I've been having some issues, and not that it doesn't stay connected, but that it's not particularly noisy or loud or whatever. Okie dokie. Well, that's all as it should be. So, I have, I think, all told about 20,000 miniatures-ish. Something like that. And it covers all of the good guys and the bad guys. But before we get too far into the weeds on the miniatures and stuff, we need to have a conversation about world building, I suppose. When you start telling a story, you usually begin at the beginning, right? You start somewhere in the story with the intention of completing a circle. The reader really feels the need to scratch those itches that you build into the story early, often. So they want to feel like they're being brought along on the adventure as well, or that perhaps if their imagination is particularly active, they feel like they're actually driving the story, and that's by and large true in terms of a role-play game, because the players really choose for us which direction we're going to go in that tale telling. Now, in this case, the story goes back quite a long ways when you're talking a 50-year long arc. Now, it's not, it should be clear that the story arc that a player goes through is not necessarily a grand or complete arc. The idea that a story is only as long as one generation is okay, and for the players involved, it certainly is a boon to know that when they finished, they finished. But generally speaking, in the case of the world of NyCOS, the story takes about 7 years, 7.5 years to play through all of the elements, simply because there is so much. Now, obviously, it wasn't that way at the beginning, and the honest truth, I say honest truth, sounds like I tell lies otherwise, but the when it comes down to the brass tacks of it, when I created the NYCOS Grand Arc, the first time through was hit or miss. It was play something different every week and come up with new stuff to relate and try to keep the players entertained. Well, it also happened that I was moving at an average at that point of about once every 2 years or so. I know that for many people that's mind-boggling because they spent their entire lives in their same hometown. But my dad was very much a salesman and a salesman's salesman to boot. And so he would literally work on a particular kind of sales operation until he became the very best at it that he could be, set any records that the companies had, and then he would get bored, want to go do something else, and away we'd go. And so those changes in life meant there were changes in my games group. It was really important, therefore, for the players that there had to be some form of continuity, and so the iteration formed sort of by accident. As each games group would start partway into the story with the tales that I would share and relegate of the players who had come before to give them motivation, hope, even in certain cases, ideas of what to do. Because when you're starting a hobby out, when the hobby first begins back in the 70s, there weren't very many of us who were storytellers. Now, everywhere I went, I was one, so there was always at least one. But the demand by players in each community was greater than the supply of storytellers, and so I would often run 3 and 4 groups even back in those days. Pardon me a second. And so, with the start out being that direction, the idea that I was running multiple games, I had to keep the stories different between them, and so it became natural for me to draw upon the stories of earlier games that I had played, with other groups. And when you are going from community to community, pardon me, I'm determining whether this needs to be a box sorted or a box just stuck to a pile for now. It looks like it's going to be just stuck to a pile. The adventure that you're sharing, therefore, has to be different enough that the other players won't catch on. And since I was moving literally city to city and state to state, we weren't just staying in the same local area. There was almost no chance of any overbleed, so to speak, from earlier run-throughs of the game. And even if there was, I don't think anybody would have relatively noticed because there were so few game masters. And so the stories that I knew I became pretty well entrenched in because I was running the same story for more than one group. Now, not at the same location, mind you. If I went to a new location, I would start with an adventure I had written perhaps before, or I would be writing a new one, and then I would run different groups on different adventures, so to speak, so that there was never a situation where I was running the same adventure serially, so there was definitely no potential for overbleed in that fashion. And to be honest, the players wouldn't have even known what that means. So, this is in 1974, 75, 76. By the time I got into high school, things had changed somewhat because I had more free time. I was always precocious. I always got, perfect grades and didn't have to do any homework because it all just happened nicely for me. I know I sound arrogant when I say that, and it's true. There's no other arrogance in my family. I have it all. But having said that, the game sessions would play out week over week, and generally it was at least once a week. Now, even at that point, I noticed that there was money on the table, so to speak, because I had friends whose fathers were golfers and who played, in weekly poker games and things like that. So I knew that there was revenue to be had in the hobby market, but I was only a kid, and what did I know? Now, to give a little bit of context, many of you may, I shouldn't say many of you, some of you may have heard before the stories of my youth, how I owned my first business when I was 12, and I sold the first business that I created for the purpose of doing so to an adult when I was 17, and fundamentally raised enough money to put myself through college. But those enterprises didn't have anything to do with games, but I still had a mind for it. And so once we get to 1979, 1980, I'm about to join the Air Force, I became aware of the change in the rules that established what was known as the original OGL, or the D20 agreement. And the D20 agreement created the largest expansion in the hobby games market to date at that point, and it literally opened the floodgates for anybody who had any interest in developing and producing RPGs to do so under the umbrella of the Dungeons and Dragons franchise, if they followed the stipulations of that open license. And I was still too young to be creating my own, and although the world developing and the world building was being done by me, the actual engagements and encounters I was totally leaving to the virtual flood of modules and adventures that were coming out. And this also included forays for me that were new into other genre, because certainly you start with high fantasy if you've been a Tolkien fan, or you've really liked Lion Witch and the Wardrobe. Those stories lend themselves to high fantasy, but it was in the same time frame with the D20 Glut that D20 Modern came out, being produced by AEG Alderac, and there was also Call of Cthulhu was big at that point. Traveler was big at that point. There was a ton of different genre out there, and so I was GMing for all of them, kind of sampling, figuring out what was useful and what was not, and shaking out the chaff, so to speak. But in running all of these different styles of games using the same D20 rules, I came to an awareness that it really, if my players are listening, you can ignore this part, guys. There's really no difference between the genres in terms of mechanics. The ambiance and the storytelling methodology you use does definitely bring in the different flavors. You can tell a spooky story compared to telling a heroic story, or you can tell a mystery, or explore a mystery, or analyze human psychology, all in role playing. So, but mechanically, there doesn't have to be any real differences between them. Some say, then why did you go so far as to create NycosRPG? Well, there's problems in all of the other classics that we've talked about, but that's for another day. I've already talked about that before. So now when we're talking about 1970s, the modules were becoming fast and furious. They were coming out new every week, and my players were looking for more adventure, more excitement, more newness, uniqueness, interest, and so they were always wanting to play on that leading edge. So I decided that it would be an easy way to do it, especially when I was young and in the military. I had time on my hands, so to speak, when I wasn't in training. So on the weekends, we would run tournaments. And in this case, by tournaments, I mean it was a profit-making venture by me, I admit it. And I didn't make enough to worry about any taxation problems or whatever. But the idea was that I would find a new module that had come out from Alderac or Troll Lord Games or Judges Guild. There's so many different publishers at the time, your head would spin. So I would just pick up a module, then I would determine what the cost of that module was. So let's say it was $9. Let's call it 10. Then I would tell my players, all 5 or 6 groups of people that I was running for, I'm going to run a tournament this weekend. It'll be 6-person blocks. We'll start at 7 in the morning, and we'll run 7. Then we'll run at noon, and then we'll run at 6 p.m. And then the next day we'll have the finals, and the best players from each of the positions in the group would join together to play the final group and run through the episode in a different way. And so I was constantly creating, because I was taking the modules as created, using them as my round 1, and we played until the players ran out of time. Generally, they didn't finish the adventure, so therefore the final outcome, the big boss fight, was always the last thing, and so therefore the adventurers that had earned their positions would then play off in the finals. And of course I would charge everybody to play, and it would be a $10 entry, but the winner would get the module and a cash prize, and the second person would get a cash prize, and the third person would get a cash prize. Then I keep the difference. And that was a very healthy little side business for me throughout the time that I was involved in that. But that was 70s and on into the very early 80s. And then how do you say it? A blessing and a tragedy occurred. I got married. in the middle of all that, I found somebody who felt she could tolerate the role play games aspect if I would, do all the other things that a husband's supposed to do. So we got married, and our games got cut way back. As a matter of fact, for almost an entire year, I didn't play, and that was not by coercion, but by my decision. And it was simply to see whether or not everything else was going to work. So I wouldn't. Well, before we'd even made it a year, she finally came to me one day and said, You're obviously missing something. You should get your friends back over here at least a couple times a week and whatever." And so within 6 months of that, we were back to full speed ahead, running at least one game a week. She was participating. She wasn't a player per se at that point, although eventually she did play for a time. But nonetheless, she literally got off my back about role play games. And I think partially it was because I was also very active with the church and was actually negotiating and dealing with the church leadership about the subject on a fairly regular basis, depending on which congregation we were with. At any rate, we went through all of that, and my groups got back to at least 2 or 3 sessions a week. Fridays and Saturdays usually were games related. But this was all on the amateur side, really speaking. I was no longer running tournaments. I was, just running my regular games group. In all candor, players still participated in a way because they knew that I was operating a family on base, and therefore they would bring snacks and food and drinks and all of that to make it easier on us so that we weren't just hosting all the time. But the mechanism for roleplay was still Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition. This was in the heyday of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons and into early 2nd edition. And But as we progressed through the time that we were jamming at this point, we were doing it at the house, and we lived on the Air Force Base. This was in Northern California, and so I didn't have much communication, even with the local hobby stores yet. I had purchased my book decades before, and I was basically reiterating. So it was the second iteration of NYCOS, and the story became more sophisticated, more adult. The monsters became more dangerous, more thought-provoking, and my game style became rather philosophical as well. I recall players staying after the games group, and we started the process, and that was when we started using the term debrief. The idea is just like in a military mission, you go on and do the mission, and then you come back and talk about how it happened, where it happened, what went right, what went wrong, what could we have done differently. And those debrief sessions became very important to the ambiance of NYCOS, because the players were no longer just a group of models on a piece of on a page moving through a map. They were actually individuals with personalities, backgrounds. One of our player couples got involved while at the table and became involved in game, and it was then I realized I was much more of a Captain Kirk in terms of storytelling. I would only draw the point out to where something was happening, and then I would move on in the scene and leave that be. So my players learned to appreciate that, but they also learned to see it as a trait that the stories that I was telling became very much like the Roddenberry era of Star Trek, in that our sessions would always have some deeper connotation that the debrief would bring out. And it wasn't necessarily intentional, but it was simply a factor of who I was as a storyteller and how that was impacting the games that I played. And I think that also is something that we're going to focus on in 2025 as we look ahead to how to improve the tabletop, and that would be to how to bring who you are as a storyteller out at the table level and make that make sense, so to speak. And I think that really is the element that I've always focused on in role-playing games, is to try to make the adventure make sense. What is going on, and why is it happening, and how does that apply to the rest of the world, and why does that apply? With that in mind, therefore, when we go, when I start looking around, Dungeons and Dragons is in the process of a purchase merger. There is Wizards of the Coast is making moves at possibly buying TSR. TSR had always had economic problems, and because I had been a self-created game master and didn't actually hold to their lore track very well, I didn't have much of an understanding even of what was going on in the games business, even during that period. Oh, I can see that's going to be the same stuff. All right. I know who those are. Okay. So the players became interested in the overall arc, the story from the beginning to end. By this time, now we've finished our second iteration, and we're starting to look at our third, and my players are way more savvy. This is in the beginning of the D20 glut. This is when the modules really are flooding out there. There's just thousands and thousands and thousands of pages to be used by different people. And my players wanted to streamline even the rules that were in Dungeons and Dragons, because there were certain issues and problems and things that were unresolved that would have been more enjoyable had they been. So we were looking at the specialization system, the skills-based system. It was hodgepodge at best, and although we fully embraced the idea of the two-hit armor class 0, that mechanism was gospel as far as we were concerned. It was a problem not for players to learn, but for other game masters to play in the same style. So I would have players that would leave my table to go play with some other friends at another site, and then within 2 or 3 weeks they'd be back and be bringing half the group that they were playing with back to NYCOS, because the game system, the world itself, made more sense. And even though I wasn't running by any other rules mechanisms yet, I still was coalescing or combining a better, deeper skills list. We called it for a while the Nexus list. Those players that are out there in the world that have played with me, who still remember Nexus, if you give me a shout out, I'd love to have an interview with you, because I think it'd be fun to talk about the developing process that we went through at that point. I'm looking at you, Jerry Backstrom. I know that you might have seen one of these videos, so I'm calling you out to talk about it. I'm also going to call out you, Rule. I'll use your hobby name, because your business name is way more ostentatious, and I wouldn't want to out you, so to speak, if that's not your crowd anymore. But the who could forget Velarim, or Elmo the Ranger, or well, bless his heart, Shandon passed away a couple of years ago. Shandon the Mage. And I apologize, young man, the person whose weapon I saw that had no equal. I can't remember your character's name right this second. I know it starts with an F. I'll remember it here in a second. But anyway, anybody who's played with me in the past, I'd love to have a conversation. I've GM'd in virtually every state in the Union, and on 6 of the 7 continents. So if you've been playing role-play games for any length of time, there's a possibility you may have sat at my table at some point, because with all those moves and such, when I was a youngster, we went to a lot of different game stores. And when I rediscovered the game stores in the late 80s, early 90s, I was all over the map in Southern California and Northern California. So if you played RPGs in either of those areas, there's a likelihood you might have sat at my table, or at least might have heard about me. Anyway, this was the establishment of the first group who actually took on as their objective to think through the story and the theme and the plot, and try to undo the plans of my villains before they ever became full-blown. And so it was a way different dynamic throughout those years. And I think the reason why I'm telling you all of this is that this period of time each year, the sessions between, are when I would revise or adjust the stories going forward. And therefore, at this point, we are at the end of the first iteration. I'm sorry, at the end of the beginning of this iteration. We're in the 9th iteration, and a astronomical function is going to shatter the understandings of my players greatly after the first of the year. I tend to run the game world in the same roughly 360-day seasons that we have here on terra firma, although the planet has a different period and all of that. And I've done the physics a long time ago and simply made it a system that's magically impossible to actually exist without magic itself being a thing, so to speak. So my players understand that and have come to embrace that, but it still is bone-jarring when something changes of the nature of that we're about to face. And it's going to It's going to change the scales quite a bit. So we're gonna see how that goes. Now, those of you that are aware, we're on the brink of the first truly global war on NyCOS. We are talking about the First World War, and both the players and the villains seem to be scrapping for a fight. So we may have some of the largest conflicts we've ever had in terms of play. Now, this does bring up another point, and that is during all the time that I played role-play games up until the 1990s, I had never seen a miniatures game played. I had never been to a game store that even carried large volume miniatures. So what I mean by that is I don't recall ever visiting a store, even in my youngster days, where you could buy chariots or cavalry or even musketeers, even though I'm very aware that the Historic Miniatures Game Society was involved in as an entity throughout this entire period and was promoting the idea of large-scale conflict and merging large-scale combat into the fantasy settings as they were opening and broadening their ranges, so to speak, to bring newer, younger players in. But I didn't have any of that. So along in around 1992, a local high school was hosting a games tournament, and I've told this story before, so I don't want to go into all of the details, but we ended up writing the adventure for the teenage kids and running the stories with our game masters so that they got to play. And that was a weather change in my thought processes on how to create. I found that I could spin out a story for that purpose in an afternoon, and within a couple of hours or even a couple of days at most, I would have an entire team of game masters ready to run at the store at the location level. Now, I wasn't thinking about it again from a revenue standpoint. I was doing it as a service to my hobby, and so I didn't generate any revenue from it, but I did get name recognition in the local newspaper. A writer right here in the Southern California area, writing for the Redlands newspaper, Mark Muckenfoos. I still remember your name. I hope to eventually connect with you, because I'd love to do a retrospective on where the game has brought me to this point, because I think that'd be a fascinating story. You might even win you a Pulitzer. But that's a completely other story. Mark. All right. So after that, we got our vision widened because the local games conventions in LA came to our attention. And so naturally I went to that. And up until that winter, I guess it was October leading towards the February convention, that I began to see that there might be a way for this to be more than just a hobby. I had made money off of it over the years, don't get me wrong. I had been a professional game master for a few times. I had done some birthday parties and special events kind of things, but nothing on a fully monetizable level at all. And so when I finally went to the LA convention, two things happened. Number one is I broke in here, and what I mean by that is I had never realized how much demand there was for good quality storytelling, how dissatisfied players were with the traditional convention fare, which was almost always railroaded adventures with a specific scoring process that meant you could only solve it one way. So I brought the adventure that I had written for the high school, which was actually written with at least two different solutions that were dynamically built into the game, with the potential for more, depending what the players did, what the game master and the players did. Generally, the game masters would try to hold the line to one solution or the other, and those that didn't also found themselves following me to events to be a storyteller for the games that I was running, because they weren't so linear. They weren't so captivating. So now that we're talking about that, where that comes into contact with what I'm doing here is that at that time, the adventures that I was running at my tabletop they weren't wrote out of the book. They were interpretations of the book, interpretations of the material, and so therefore pretty soon the material itself was lost in time. I don't even know what happened to the material from which they were designed, but the ability to change and create story was radically affected. And I needed to back up for a second anyway to talk about this, and that was my time in the military had changed from electronics into air traffic control, and that again just opened my eyes to the possibilities and set up the path that we're on now, which is the idea of moving towards the poly story or the meta story. And I think that when players kind of get the idea of what it is we're talking about here, game masters will be able to accommodate 4 or 5 different storylines at the same time, through the same process, and there will be an explosion of role play that we haven't seen. It's not a removal of the old classic ways. It's an amplification and a redefinition, sort of in terms of modern mechanisms, not modern storytelling. So I'm not taking away anything from the classic mechanisms. I still want my players to feel like they've saved the world and are doing the things they're doing to be the heroes of the world. One of my groups called themselves, of course, Big Damn Heroes, after the champions from Firefly, just because that's such a good title. So they were the Big Damn Heroes. And I've got other groups that use other names like Heralds of the Change or Strangers in a Strange Land. There's all these different groups, and they're all focused on concluding the game. And my time as an air traffic controller was absolutely crucial to being able to develop the mechanism that allows me to run 6, 8, 10, maybe even more campaigns at a time and keep everybody sane, happy, and advancing. So, alrighty, we are coming up to the 4 here. So, with that change, with the ability of bringing the air traffic control concept to game mastery, and the convention events to the style of play that I was doing, all of a sudden I realized that I was not getting to do what I wanted to, because at the games convention that very first time I was introduced to miniatures play. Warhammer 40K. Now, I had read about it. I had been a fan of White Dwarf magazine and Dragon magazine and Dungeon magazine and any other periodical that was focused on the business, so to speak. But none of them prepared me for that, shall I say, neo-orgasmic response of seeing all those miniatures on the table displayed across a battlefield with a tiny town and little villagers. And it was just... I was hooked. I wanted to do that. And so the game system that I had brought, the games that I had been traditionally running, were all linear 4-hour sessions, role-play centered, and the rules of the convention was that you could get a badge for the event and the ability and 1/4 of a room to crash in. Basically, they would rent rooms out to game masters, but the game masters' pay would be in the form of reimbursement for the hotel room. So you weren't having to put the money up front, but you could play, and then once you fulfilled your commitment, then you could stay the rest of the convention and play to your heart's desire. Well, the challenge with that is that the minimum requirements for all of that was 4 4-hour game sessions. So that's 16 hours of RPG play. And you're generally getting there Friday after work, so you're talking Saturday and Sunday only. And out of that 48 hours, fully 16 of them were work, in essence. You were playing, but you were providing service. But with my air traffic control background, I thought, well, why can't I run 4 groups in the same adventure at the same time with the same objective, have them compete against each other, and then the winners would be much more obvious because they would be the ones that completed the adventure. And so I endeavored to write the first 4-tiered adventure simultaneously so that each group could pursue a different part of the story and solve for X, and the X being the same in all 4 groups. And we had 4 tables of 6 players each, and I ran them linearly the first time through just to make sure each module would work. And then I went to the people who ran the convention and said, look, are we a serial or a parallel process? And they looked at me kind of funny. I said, well, just like in a computer, you can work things serially, first one, then the other, then the other, then the other. Or you can run them in parallel, where you run all 4 adventures simultaneously, and the solutions for each is really the same. So therefore, whoever finishes first or accomplishes the goal is the one that wins. And they said, oh, yeah, you could do that. I suppose you could do that as long as you found a way to administer that, because you still need that many storytellers. I said, no, I'm going to make it so I can run it by myself. And so it was fundamentally, I basically set it up like a RapCon. If you're not an air traffic controller, that means nothing to you. But the RapCon is radio approach control centers, and you have multiple RapCons if you have multiple airports in an area, but they're all under the same umbrella of air traffic. And so I would literally go into each room and give them the updates on what was going on in their scene. They would then give me their actions, what they would do or whatever. Then I'd say, go ahead and roll your dice, and I'll be right back. And then I'd go to the next group and do the same thing. So I would just cycle through all 4 of the rooms. Each one of them got me for about a third of the time, which was, it worked out okay from their standpoint. But I was working like a paper hanger, so to speak, just busy, busy, busy. And when we got done with that session, everybody was satisfied. We knew who the winner was. They got the prize. Yay. Clap, clap, clap. Everybody's together. Have a great time. Thanks. We'll talk. We'll see you later. And then I would leave because I was going to go play miniatures. I had done in 4 hours what would normally take 16, so I could now play games for the rest of the time. Or so I thought. So as I'm setting up the miniatures and getting prepared, I'm just getting acclimated to how they're played. I haven't even purchased my own. I'm just sharing somebody else's army. A guy comes up behind me. Bless his heart. I still remember him to this day. Tony Steiner. He says, Jonathan, that game you ran yesterday, can we play that again? Well, yes, but it was set up to run for 24 players, so I was thinking to myself, I don't want to have to get caught doing this over and over again, so maybe if I put some stipulations on it, it'll go away. So I said, well, I'll do it if we have a full complement. He says, oh, I've got 24 players upstairs already. We may even have a couple more. Is it possible you could write in some new characters? Now, okay. Well, needless to say, I didn't get to play miniatures during that campaign. That weekend, I was booked. But I also realized that mechanism was way too burdensome. It was eating way too much of my energy, to the point where on Saturday I literally couldn't drive home. I had to stay over an extra night just to recuperate because I'd stayed up almost all night long in preparation. Oh, it was a mess. So then, realizing that I would probably need to write something like this for the next event, I shifted gears and moved away from the fantasy setting because I didn't want to eat up that many hours of my time running that way. So I came up with the system that is now known as Parallels. You may have heard of it. I ran it during the 90s on the West Coast, and if you're a West Coast gamer and you're listening to this, you may remember the large events at the Strategicon, which were called either virtualities or parallels or just the big Star Trek game. And it was a hybrid between a board game. Let me rephrase that. It was a hybrid between a miniatures game using Star Trek Micro Machines miniatures and other things to represent the starships in a space map kind of conflict, simultaneously with a role-playing drama set in a more conducive role-playing venue, such as in our case the series Deep Space Nine had just come out, and so it was like a perfect place to host the event. And so the players would break their teams. We would assign each group the same size as an adventuring group, the identity of a team. So Federation and Klingon, Cardassian, whatever, they got to be whatever group of beings they wanted to be, but their team was then broken down into a tactical side that dealt with the starships and an ambassadorial side that dealt with the politics. And there were only runners that could carry information between the two. They were not allowed to actually visit the other site or even to kibitz with those commanders other than extremely limited circumstances. I won't go into the details, but it was a mechanical thing. But it was also the first mechanism that was completely diceless, completely no random number generation at all. It was simply what the players did versus what the other players did, with myself and my coordinators. At that point, we had 2 or 3 coordinators that would help to handle the groups, because our size was not limited by that 24 spaces. As a matter of fact, by the 3rd season, so it would have been 94, 93, 94, in that framework, we were having between 45 and 70 players in every game session. And what was really fascinating is that the same adventure, exact same story, could be retold in another time slot simply by letting the players change teams and change positions to learn what they didn't know about the story from the other positions that they had played. It was lauded. There was an article put out, I can't remember when, and somebody could find it, I'd love it. There was an article that was done about our game in the LA Times. The convention was actually covered in the calendar section, which is it was a pretty good deal to get that coverage, and we were mentioned in there as well. And eventually it got large enough that we ran the same event, the largest one I ever devised, for 107 players across every species known at the time in the Star Trek environment. Since I was running it with no profit margin, no profitability or anything like that, it was just purely for us, the fans, and it was monstrous. We had 107 players, and people throughout the convention were talking about what was going on. As a matter of fact, there were people that thought we might have taken over the convention because our team were dressed in spiffy little uniforms, and some considered us to be a more accurate source of staff information than the actual staff of the convention. But that's neither here nor there. As it turned out, we ran all the way up until 1998, 1999, and then the world changed because I went to work for Gamma. But that's a story for another night. I want to thank you for having stayed with us this hour. I hope that there was a lot of information that I shared with you that was useful to you. I really haven't gotten to accomplish what I was going to, but that's because I got into storyteller mode, and this was not a story I've fully fleshed out much before. So I want to thank you for being here and listening in. If you like what you're hearing and want to become a part of our community, check out patreon.com/NyCos. And if you join us there, you'll gain access to our Discord and can become a player and a citizen of NYCOS and be apprised of what's going on in the games world going forward. Other than that, I want to thank you for being here. Like and subscribe, and hit all the buttons, because that's necessary. But I would recommend that if you get a chance, check out our YouTube page at NycosRPG. There are 700, 800 videos there, and you can kind of watch the evolution of this entire process as it unfolded. Thank you again, and we hope to see you in the next episode. Talk to you soon.